And now, the Deeper Thinking podcast, where philosophy, psychology, and power collide.
Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. This episode explores the Age of Enlightenment, a period that transformed the intellectual, political, and cultural landscape of the modern world. Rather than a simplistic celebration of reason's triumph or a reductive critique of its contradictions, this episode seeks to take a measured and engaging exploration of the Enlightenment's ideas, tracing its evolution from the early rationalist and empiricist debates to its revolutionary impact on democracy, science, and human rights. The episode examines key thinkers such as Descartes, Locke, Voltaire, Rousseau, Kant, and others, exploring how their work challenged authority, reshaped philosophy, and laid the foundations for modern thought. It also considers critiques from Romanticism, conservative reactionaries like Burke, postmodern theorists such as Foucault, and contemporary debates about the Enlightenment's legacy in an era of digital information, artificial intelligence, and political polarization. Whether you are well-versed in Enlightenment philosophy or discovering these ideas for the first time, this episode offers a thought-provoking journey through the intellectual movement that continues to shape our world. For further reading and ways to support us, visit the Deeper Thinking podcast at podbean.com. Let's dive in. In the dim corridors of medieval Europe, knowledge was bound in chains, both metaphorically and literally. Manuscripts, cloistered in monasteries, were the dominion of monks and scholars who saw learning as a function of divine revelation rather than human inquiry. The prevailing order was one of rigid hierarchy. The church dictated moral truths, the monarchy ruled by divine right, and dissent was met with silence or suppression. The few who dared to challenge dogma, heretics, alchemists, skeptics, often paid for their curiosity with their lives. This was a world where reason bowed to authority, where philosophy was a handmaiden to theology, and where the notion of individual rights was but a whisper against the roar of collective doctrine. Yet beneath this seemingly impenetrable structure, the embers of inquiry smouldered, awaiting the right conditions to burst into flame. Change did not arrive in a single moment, but as a slow tectonic shift. The Renaissance had already begun to challenge the dominance of religious orthodoxy, with thinkers like Erasmus and Machiavelli proposing alternative models of virtue and governance. The Protestant Reformation had fractured the monolithic authority of the Church, allowing the possibility, however radical, that truth could be questioned, interpreted, and even redefined. Meanwhile, the scientific revolution had begun to unshackle the human mind from its medieval constraints. Copernicus placed the sun, not the earth, at the centre of the cosmos. Galileo defied the Vatican by peering through a telescope and seeing not divine perfection, but celestial imperfection. Newton's Principia offered a vision of the universe governed by mathematical laws, not divine whims. The natural world was no longer a sacred mystery. It was a system, comprehensible and, crucially, manipulable by human intellect. But reason alone was not enough to dismantle centuries of entrenched belief. Fear still lingered. The political order, after all, was built on the premise that knowledge must be controlled to maintain stability. The more radical implications of free thought, that kings might not be divine, that the people might govern themselves, that moral laws were not dictated from above but constructed by society, were yet to come. What was needed was a philosophical revolution, a challenge not merely to religious dogma, but to the very foundations of authority itself. This was the crucible of the Age of Enlightenment. It would be Descartes who first dared to doubt everything, laying the groundwork for a new foundation of certainty. It would be Locke who argued that the mind was not born with divine ideas, but was shaped by experience. And it would be Voltaire who wielded satire like a sword, cutting through the hypocrisy of church and state alike. The world was on the precipice of transformation, and reason was about to seize its moment. Doubt, once a perilous indulgence, was now a tool of liberation. René Descartes, a man of rigorous intellect and relentless skepticism, sought to strip away every assumption, every inherited belief, until he could find an unshakable foundation upon which to rebuild human knowledge. In his Meditations on First Philosophy, he embarked on a radical exercise, to doubt everything that could possibly be doubted. The senses, he argued, were unreliable. One need only recall the illusions of dreams or the deceptions of mirages to see their fallibility. The external world, too, could be a grand illusion, a fabrication of an all-powerful deceiver. Even mathematical truths, those seemingly eternal certainties, could be the product of a trickster god manipulating the human mind. But there was one thing he could not doubt, the very act of doubting itself. Cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. This was his bedrock, his first principle of certainty. From this modest foothold, he reconstructed a vision of the world grounded not in faith or tradition, but in reason alone. Yet reason, in Descartes' hands, was still tethered to a higher power. His rational method ultimately led him back to God, a necessary guarantor of truth in a universe that might otherwise be filled with deception. His rationalism, though revolutionary, remained a bridge between medieval theology and modern philosophy. Others, however, would take his method further. Spinoza, the exiled Jewish philosopher of Amsterdam, would strip the divine of its anthropomorphic robes, replacing a personal deity with an impersonal, infinite substance, nature itself. For Spinoza, God was not an entity that intervened in human affairs, but the very structure of existence. His ethics, written in the geometric style of Euclid, sought to map the human condition with the same precision as a mathematical proof. Emotions, he argued, were not mysterious or transcendent. They were natural forces governed by the same deterministic laws as the motion of planets. The universe, in Spinoza's vision, was not a divine kingdom but a vast, interwoven mechanism, knowable through reason alone. As rationalism took shape, a countercurrent emerged, challenging its rigid structure. Empiricism, led by thinkers like John Locke and later David Hume, rejected the idea that knowledge could emerge purely from the intellect. Instead, they argued the mind was a blank slate, a tabula rasa upon which experience etched its lessons. For Locke, knowledge was the product of sensation and reflection. There were no innate ideas, only those formed through contact with the world. Hume would take this to its most unsettling extreme, questioning not only the origin of knowledge, but its very reliability. If all we know is experience, then what guarantees causality? The fact that the sun has risen every morning does not prove that it will rise again tomorrow. The certainty that Descartes sought, that Spinoza believed was embedded in nature itself, now faced its greatest challenge, the spectre of radical skepticism. Skepticism, once the whisper of a few dissenting voices, now threatened to unravel the very fabric of certainty itself. David Hume, the sharpest of the empiricist critics, was relentless in his pursuit of doubt. If knowledge came only through experience, then nothing, neither reason nor God, nor even the laws of nature, was immune to scrutiny. Cause and effect, he argued, was not a rational necessity, but a habit of the mind, an expectation formed through repeated experience. The human mind, upon seeing one event follow another, assumes a causal connection, but such a connection is never directly observed. The fire burns paper, the stone falls when dropped, but nowhere in these events does one find causation itself, only sequence. This was a devastating conclusion, for if causality was an illusion, then the entire edifice of science and philosophy, which rested on the ability to infer future truths from past experiences, was suddenly in jeopardy. Hume did not stop there. He turned his skeptical gaze toward the self, the seemingly stable foundation of human identity. If knowledge was derived from experience, and experience was nothing more than fleeting impressions, then what was the self but a bundle of such impressions stitched together by memory and habit? There was no unchanging core, no fixed soul, just a succession of thoughts and perceptions endlessly shifting. It was a radical departure from centuries of religious and philosophical tradition, which had taken the self as an immutable essence, a soul imbued with divine purpose. In Hume's vision, the self was not a sovereign entity, but an ephemeral collection of moments, ceaselessly dissolving and reforming. This skepticism, however, did not lead Hume to despair, but to pragmatism. Life went on, regardless of philosophical doubts. Even if causation could not be logically justified, people still acted as if it were real. Even if the self was an illusion, one still made choices, felt emotions, sought pleasure, and avoided pain. Hume's conclusion was unsettling but liberating. Reason, for all its grandeur, was not the guiding force of human life. Passion ruled, custom dictated, and belief persisted despite the absence of rational justification. It was this tension between reason's ambitions and its limitations that would set the stage for the Enlightenment's next great confrontation. Across the Channel, in France, a different breed of thinkers was emerging, philosophies who were not content with merely dissecting knowledge, but sought to reshape society itself. Voltaire, with his biting wit and scathing satire, turned philosophy into a weapon against tyranny and superstition. Rousseau, with his fervent belief in human nature, would reject the cold rationalism of his contemporaries in favour of something wilder, more instinctual. The Enlightenment was no longer just a philosophical inquiry. It was becoming a battle for the soul of civilization. Voltaire was a man at war with kings, with priests, with the very idea that ignorance and superstition should govern human affairs. Armed with his pen, he cut through the hypocrisy of church and state, wielding satire as skillfully as a swordsman. His Candide, a searing mockery of blind optimism, dismantled the notion that this was the best of all possible worlds, ridiculing the complacency that allowed suffering to persist under the guise of divine providence. In his letters and essays, he attacked religious dogma, not out of hatred for faith itself, but for its corruption in the hands of institutions that sought to suppress thought rather than inspire it. "Écrasez l'infâme," crush the infamous thing, became his rallying cry against fanaticism and oppression. Voltaire did not call for the abolition of religion, but for its reformation, its rationalization. Deism, the belief in a creator who set the universe in motion but did not intervene in human affairs, was to him a philosophy fit for an enlightened age. Yet even Voltaire's biting critique of power paled in comparison to the radicalism of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. If Voltaire was the Enlightenment's great skeptic, Rousseau was its great believer. Not in reason, but in nature, in instinct, in the purity of the human soul before civilization had corrupted it. Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains, he declared, rejecting the notion that monarchy, aristocracy, or even modernity itself was a sign of progress. Where Hobbes had seen the state of nature as a brutish war of all against all, Rousseau saw harmony, innocence, a world where people lived simply, unburdened by the inequalities imposed by property and power. Society, in his view, had shackled humanity, creating artificial hierarchies, fostering greed, and alienating individuals from their natural state of freedom. But if civilization had deformed humanity, could it not also be reformed? Rousseau's answer lay in the concept of the general will, a collective force that represented the true interests of the people, not just the will of the majority or the dictates of rulers. In his social contract, he argued that legitimate political authority did not come from divine right or hereditary rule, but from the consent of the governed. Unlike Locke, who had envisioned a liberal government protecting individual rights, Rousseau imagined a deeper, more participatory democracy, where individuals subsumed their private interests to the collective good. These ideas would prove both inspiring and dangerous. Voltaire's critiques would embolden revolutionaries. Rousseau's theories would provide a blueprint for upheaval, and together they would help light the fire of the French Revolution. But as history would soon reveal, the Enlightenment's vision of reason, liberty, and progress was far more fragile than its thinkers had dared to admit. The Enlightenment's bold challenge to tradition had ignited revolutions, intellectual, political, and social. Nowhere was this transformation more profound than in the realm of governance. Montesquieu, with his forensic analysis of political systems, argued that tyranny was not merely the result of cruel rulers, but of unchecked power itself. In the spirit of the laws, he proposed the radical idea that liberty depended on a separation of powers, a government divided into branches, each capable of restraining the other. His model, drawn from an analysis of the British Constitution, would inspire the framers of the American Republic and shape the very foundations of modern democracy. Yet even Montesquieu's careful balance of power paled in comparison to the bold moral vision of Immanuel Kant. Kant, the most formidable thinker of the Enlightenment's later years, sought to answer a question that had haunted philosophy for centuries. What does it mean to be truly free? For Kant, freedom was not merely political, it was moral, a duty to act according to reason rather than impulse. His critique of pure reason was a devastating analysis of human knowledge, demonstrating that while experience shapes understanding, the mind itself imposes fundamental structures, categories of space, time, and causality on reality. But it was in his groundwork for the metaphysics of morals that Kant laid out his most profound and enduring legacy, the categorical imperative. Morality, he argued, could not be based on consequence, culture, or divine command. Instead, it had to be grounded in universal reason. Act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. In other words, an ethical action was one that could be applied universally without contradiction. It was an austere, demanding vision of morality, but one that granted dignity to every individual, recognizing them as an autonomous being rather than a means to an end. These political and moral revolutions found their ultimate test in the crucible of history. The American Revolution, deeply influenced by the Enlightenment, enshrined principles of liberty and self-governance in its founding documents. The Declaration of Independence, with its assertion that all men are created equal, echoed the natural rights theory of Locke. The US Constitution, with its intricate system of checks and balances, bore the unmistakable imprint of Montesquieu, and yet the contradictions of Enlightenment thought became immediately apparent. The same revolution that proclaimed universal freedom was built on a system of slavery. The same thinkers who praised reason often excluded women and non-Europeans from their visions of justice. The ideals of the Enlightenment were powerful, but they were also selective in their application. These tensions would soon explode in an even greater revolution, one that would shake the very foundations of Europe itself. The French Revolution was the Enlightenment's reckoning, a moment when ideas that had once been confined to books and salons burst into the streets and into the halls of power. What had begun as a call for constitutional reform quickly escalated into the most radical political experiment the modern world had ever seen. The Ancien regime, with its rigid hierarchies, hereditary privilege and unchecked monarchy, was no longer defensible in an age where Rousseau's cry for liberty and Montesquieu's theories of balanced governance had taken root in the popular imagination. The Estates General, a relic of medieval governance, was revived in 1789, but it could not contain the surge of revolutionary energy that had been unleashed. The Third Estate, representing the common people, declared itself the National Assembly, and in that moment, sovereignty shifted from kings to the people. Revolution was not just theoretical now, it was unfolding in real time, and its trajectory was unpredictable. The Bastille fell. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen was drafted, proclaiming liberty, equality, and fraternity as the new order of the day. The monarchy crumbled, the guillotine rose, and France became a republic. But with each step toward liberation came new contradictions. The Enlightenment had promised reason, yet the revolution descended into terror. Robespierre, once a champion of democratic ideals, transformed into the architect of a regime that executed thousands in the name of virtue. The revolution had been born from the principles of the philosophies, but in its radical fervour, it revealed the limitations of Enlightenment thought. Could reason alone govern human affairs? Could liberty be imposed by force? Could universal rights coexist with the political realities of power? The revolution's contradictions were not lost on its critics. Edmund Burke, the British conservative thinker, saw in France not the dawn of a new age, but the collapse of civilization itself. In Reflections on the Revolution in France, he warned that the Enlightenment's faith in abstract reason had blinded its thinkers to the complexities of history, culture, and tradition. Societies, he argued, were not machines to be reassembled at will, but living organisms that evolved over centuries. To tear down an institution overnight, in the belief that reason alone could rebuild it, was to invite chaos. Burke's critique would become a cornerstone of conservative thought, a counterweight to the idea that human progress was inevitable. Yet the revolution was not merely a cautionary tale. It reshaped Europe, toppling monarchies, inspiring nationalist movements, and forcing political philosophers to grapple with new realities. Even as it ended in the rise of Napoleon, who crowned himself emperor in a dramatic reversal of republican ideals, the revolution had irrevocably changed the world. The Enlightenment's dreams had been tested in the crucible of history, and though they had not emerged unscathed, they had left an indelible mark. But the story was not over. A new force was rising, one that would challenge the very foundations of Enlightenment rationality, the Romantic rebellion. Romanticism emerged as the Great Disillusionment, a revolt against the cold, mechanical rationality that had defined the Enlightenment. Where the philosophies had placed their faith in reason, the Romantics placed theirs in emotion, intuition, and the ineffable power of nature. To them, the Enlightenment's insistence on order, classification, and universal principles had stripped the world of its mystery and reduced human beings to mere cogs in a rationalist machine. They did not reject the pursuit of knowledge outright, but they challenged its arrogance, the belief that reason alone could explain the depths of human experience, that societies could be engineered like clockwork, that history could be directed according to rational principles. In their view, the Enlightenment's optimism had been shattered on the guillotine's blade, and in its place, a more turbulent, passionate vision of humanity was needed. No figure embodied this romantic rebellion more than Jean-Jacques Rousseau, though he had preceded the movement itself. Unlike Voltaire, who had mocked religion, Rousseau sought spirituality in nature. Unlike Kant, who constructed morality through abstract reason, Rousseau believed that true virtue was found in the heart, in an uncorrupted, pre-civilized state of being. His vision of the noble savage, a human being unshackled by social conventions, living freely and authentically, resonated deeply with the Romantics, who saw civilization not as progress but as imprisonment. The poet William Blake railed against the mind-forged manacles of Enlightenment rationalism, seeing in it the chains of industrialization and dehumanization. Goethe's The Sorrows of Young Werther depicted the agony of a man ruled by passion, undone by the rigidity of society. Beethoven's symphonies erupted with raw emotion, rejecting the neat mathematical precision of previous classical music. Yet Romanticism was not merely an aesthetic movement, it was a philosophical challenge. The Enlightenment had spoken of universal laws, of human nature, of politics, of morality, but the Romantics rejected the idea that human experience could be so easily categorized. Instead, they embraced the particular, the unique, the unrepeatable. History was not a steady march of progress, but a swirling current of forces, driven by passion, struggle, and individuality. Where the Enlightenment had imagined a world governed by rational actors, the Romantics saw human beings as creatures of desire, myth, and longing. Theirs was a vision that did not seek to master nature but to commune with it, to lose oneself in its vastness rather than reduce it to scientific principles. In politics, this shift had profound consequences. Nationalism, previously a marginal force, found fertile ground in Romantic thought. Where the Enlightenment had spoken of universal rights and reason as a shared human inheritance, the Romantics turned toward identity, culture, and the spirit of a people. Revolution was no longer just a question of abstract principles, it was a question of destiny, of myth, of belonging. The rational, secular ideals of the Enlightenment had not been erased, but they had been challenged, tempered by an awareness that human beings were more than just reasoning machines. They were creatures of poetry, of madness, of dreams. The modern world would have to contend with both visions, the cold light of reason and the burning fire of passion. As the 19th century unfolded, the battle between reason and passion gave way to an even deeper reckoning. If the Enlightenment had sought universal truths and the Romantics had championed the raw power of human emotion, the next wave of thinkers would question whether truth itself was even possible. The emergence of existentialism, historicism, and later postmodernism would cast doubt on the very foundations of the Enlightenment project. The belief in objective knowledge, in progress, in the supremacy of human reason, these assumptions, once unshakable, now seemed fragile, even illusory. Friedrich Nietzsche, perhaps the most devastating critic of the Enlightenment, delivered its ultimate death knell with his declaration, "God is dead." Nietzsche did not mean this merely in a religious sense. He meant that the Enlightenment had dismantled the structures that had given meaning to human life. Faith, tradition, divine authority, without replacing them with anything equally compelling. Science, for all its achievements, could explain the workings of the universe, but not why life mattered. The Enlightenment's confidence in reason, morality, and progress was, in Nietzsche's view, little more than a new form of dogma, a secular faith that refused to acknowledge its own limitations. He saw in Kant's morality a disguised version of Christian ethics, in democracy a system that still sought to impose artificial order on an indifferent world. His response was radical. The Übermensch, the individual who would forge new values beyond good and evil, embracing the chaos of existence rather than seeking to control it. If Nietzsche called for a revaluation of all values, Michel Foucault took this deconstruction even further. In his sweeping critiques of history, knowledge, and power, he argued that the Enlightenment's ideals of reason and liberty were not the forces of emancipation they claimed to be, but mechanisms of control. Knowledge, he suggested, was not neutral but entangled with power. What a society calls truth is often merely a reflection of those who hold authority. Enlightenment reason had not freed humanity. It had simply replaced one form of domination with another. The prison, the clinic, the asylum, these were not merely institutions of care or justice, but of discipline, designed to shape and control individuals under the guise of rationality. This radical skepticism about knowledge and progress would culminate in postmodernism, which questioned whether universal truth was even attainable. The grand narratives of history, the Enlightenment's story of progress, Marx's theory of class struggle, even the idea of a coherent self, were exposed as myths, constructs that obscured the complexity and instability of reality. Reason, once the Enlightenment's greatest weapon against superstition, was now itself under attack, accused of being just another ideology. And yet, despite these critiques, the Enlightenment had not been abandoned. Its ideals, freedom, human rights, the pursuit of knowledge, continued to shape the modern world, even as they were constantly challenged. But in an era of digital misinformation, algorithmic control, and a deepening crisis of truth, a new question emerged. Was the Enlightenment truly unfinished, or was it unravelling before our eyes? The Enlightenment's legacy had always been contested, but in the digital age, its fundamental principles faced an unprecedented crisis. The dream of a world governed by reason, where knowledge would liberate individuals from ignorance and tyranny, had been both realised and betrayed. Information, once scarce and guarded by gatekeepers, was now abundant, available at a keystroke, flooding the minds of billions. Yet, rather than ushering in a new age of enlightenment, this explosion of information had led to confusion, polarization, and the fragmentation of truth itself. The same rational tools that the philosophies had championed, the printing press, literacy, open discourse, had evolved into technologies that both democratized knowledge and distorted it. Misinformation thrived alongside expertise. Conspiracy theories held as much influence as scholarly debate. The rational citizen, capable of self-governance, seemed to be vanishing into algorithmic bubbles and tribal thinking. Social media, which promised to connect and educate, instead fueled division. The Enlightenment's ideal of public reason, a space where individuals engage in rational debate, test ideas, and refine knowledge, had been replaced by digital echo chambers where confirmation bias reigned. In the 18th century, Voltaire had fought for the right to challenge authority, to question dogma, to break the hold of superstition. In the 21st century, the question was no longer whether one had the right to speak, but whether anyone could be heard above the din of competing realities. What happens to democracy, to rational discourse, when truth itself becomes a matter of preference rather than inquiry? Artificial intelligence, too, raised profound questions about the future of reason. If the Enlightenment had placed faith in the individual's ability to think, deliberate, and act freely, what did it mean when algorithms could predict, manipulate, and even replace human decision-making? Machine learning systems, trained on vast oceans of data, could process information faster than any human mind, but they did not reason as the Enlightenment thinkers had envisioned. They optimized, they calculated, they reinforced patterns rather than questioning them. In an age where artificial intelligence could draft essays, diagnose diseases, and even compose music, was reason still an innately human faculty, or was it something that could now be outsourced? The paradox of modernity was that the tools of the Enlightenment, science, reason, communication, had created both extraordinary progress and new forms of intellectual crisis. The dream of universal knowledge had given birth to an information overload. The promise of rational self-governance had collided with the reality of digital manipulation. The battle was no longer between reason and superstition, but between competing versions of rationality itself. If the Enlightenment had once freed humanity from the shackles of dogma, the question now was whether it could save itself from the world it had created. The age of reason had not ended, but it had entered a new and uncertain chapter, one where its very survival was at stake. The Enlightenment was never a single moment, a finished project, or an uncontested victory. It was and remains an ongoing struggle, a battle between knowledge and ignorance, progress and regression, autonomy and authority. Its greatest ideals, liberty, reason, democracy, human rights, have been both celebrated and subverted, advanced and betrayed. Every age since the 18th century has declared itself the heir to Enlightenment principles while grappling with their contradictions. The revolutions it inspired promised freedom, but often gave way to new forms of oppression. Its vision of universal knowledge led to scientific triumphs, but also to the machinery of war and surveillance. Its faith in human reason was met with skepticism, first by romanticism, then by existentialism, and now by a world in which artificial intelligence and algorithmic decision-making threaten to redefine what it means to think. But the Enlightenment was never about certainty. It was about questioning. It did not offer final answers. It provided methods, frameworks, and the audacity to challenge authority. It insisted that no truth should be immune from scrutiny, that no power should be left unchecked, that no individual should be denied the right to reason for themselves. In an era where disinformation spreads faster than evidence, where populist movements reject expertise in favour of gut instinct, where the very idea of objective truth is under siege, the need for an enlightenment, perhaps a new enlightenment, has never been greater. This is not a call for nostalgia, for a return to the thinking of the 18th century as if it held all the solutions. The original Enlightenment was flawed, incomplete, and at times complicit in the very injustices it sought to challenge. It spoke of liberty while tolerating slavery, of reason while dismissing entire cultures, of universal rights while denying them to women, colonized peoples, and the disenfranchised. To carry its spirit forward is not to preserve it unchanged, but to demand that it evolve, to refine its principles, expand its inclusivity, and confront the challenges of the 21st century with the same radical curiosity that defined it in the past. The Enlightenment is unfinished because the work of reason is never done. Every generation must defend knowledge against obscurantism, must balance skepticism with wisdom, must decide whether progress is something inevitable or something that must be fought for. The question is no longer whether the Enlightenment was right or wrong, but whether we still have the courage to think, to doubt, to question power, and to believe that human reason, for all its limits and failures, is still the best hope we have. Until next time.
This episode of the Deeper Thinking podcast was written, produced and researched by Benjamin James. It was read by Holly, a digital narrator. For further reading, resources and a chance to support the show, visit the episode webpage, where you'll find book recommendations, key topics to explore, and a way to buy me a coffee. And if you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review on your preferred platform